Good afternoon, Ambassador Hayes, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to welcome all of our students who've joined us today near and far. Maybe some of you are here on UF's campus and maybe some of you are dialing in from home or elsewhere. I'm Marianne Vernetson. I'm the Associate Director here at the Graham Center. I oversee our public programs and our student activities, including this series. So we're going to hear a short presentation from Ambassador Hayes, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. I would ask you to keep yourself muted during the presentation. You can use the chat feature for questions or the raise hand function. We are recording the session and we'll have it on our website afterward, and we will also circulate it to you. So I'm pleased to host our first session this spring on careers in public service. You will hear from Gator Grad and former U.S. Ambassador to Suriname, Dennis Hayes. He's going to share a bit about his career path and experience in the Foreign Service, and also give you a chance to ask him some questions and discuss resources that'll help you launch a successful career. Ambassador Hayes, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, although I would rather be there. It's going to be 19 degrees tonight outside Washington, and I usually counted on coming down to Gainesville about this time of year to start working on my tan. You can never start too soon, as you know. But it is good with the new technology, at least get together at this point. Would you like me to just sort of jump in and start going? Okay. Well, as mentioned, I was a Foreign Service officer for about 25 years. I started in the Foreign Service basically right out of Gainesville. In fact, twists of fate, which sometimes come around. I had two sort of brushes with the Foreign Service before I actually became one. The first one was about my junior year. I looked up and I saw there was something called the Foreign Service Advisor in the faculty in Little was the building. So I went over and walked in, and there was a guy sitting there, and I said, "Hey, I'm interested in the Foreign Service. What can you tell me?" And he looked at me, and in those days I had pretty long hair and bell bottoms and tie-dyed shirt and everything. And he said, "You'll never get in." And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, thank you for your time and support here." Despite that, though, it came up again after I graduated, but I was waiting to go to law school, back to be a double Gator. And I rode the bus into Washington, D.C., where I had a job stuffing envelopes on Capitol Hill, and I rode with a guy in the Foreign Service who would tell me wonderful stories about serving in Karachi and Asmara and various places that sounded exotic and interesting. And he told me to take the test, and I did, and sort of my career path went completely off to the side. I want to talk a little bit about, in those days, this was mid-70s at this point, and really the Foreign Service was one of the few ways to kind of have a career where you served overseas. These days, of course, there are many ways, not just with government, but with business, with NGOs, foundations. There's lots of ways. And if you're interested in serving overseas, I think there's a couple things I would encourage you to sort of reflect on and think about, and notice that, language skills are important, but you can pick those up. What's more important is that you have to want to live and work overseas. You have to have an eagerness to do that. And you would be surprised at how many people, including members of the Foreign Service, hate foreigners, and they live overseas and they're in the middle of foreigners. How does that happen? Well, it does, but it's too bad because they tend, one, not to be successful, and two, they tend not to be happy. So you really have to sort of be willing to immerse yourself in a different culture, to deal with different people and recognize sort of, what they can tell you and what you can tell them along the way. Now, unlike, say, the Army or the Navy or something, we don't have tanks and aircraft carriers. In the Foreign Service and in most of the areas of civilian service that I'm familiar with, the coin of the realm is information. And if you, whatever your job is, if you can provide accurate, timely information in the area where you're working, then you have great value to your bosses and to the nation, for that matter. To do that, there's a couple things. Obviously, you need to know your subject. You need to know it well. You have to recognize that you have a culture and they have a culture, and they may have multiple cultures. And depending upon what city you're in or region or part of town, it can be different. And part of, I think, having a successful sort of life and career in foreign service, small s, is to be able to recognize that and to work with it. As a first a junior officer and then working my way up to ambassadorships, I can tell you reputation is everything. If you have a good reputation, again, for being able to provide accurate and timely information, you will go far. If your reputation is you don't know what you're talking about, or you exaggerate, or you, even worse, misstate things, then you got a problem, and you're sure you're going to have that. In this, of course, it's important to anticipate questions that are coming up. You look for connections. You ask first, as Marcus Aurelius said, why does he do this thing? I mean, it's not just the what, but the why in the Foreign Service is very important. Why does somebody act in this way? When people are advocating for things, the first thing I look for is intensity. What's the level of intensity? How much do people care about this? Do they care about this? And you have to recognize that words have meaning. And in particularly in a formal and a diplomatic setting, words have a lot of meaning. What's the name of that body of water where the Chinese are building those islands? What's the name of that? Anybody know? Anybody? Hands up or anyone? South China Sea, is that what I hear? Yeah. Well, okay. What's the problem with the Chinese building the new islands in the South China Sea? After all, it's the South China Sea, right? But what do the Vietnamese call that water? They call it the Eastern Sea. What do the Philippines call it? Well, they call it the Gulf of Luzon. Malaysia, it's the Cham Gulf. And that makes a difference. If the Vietnamese, who have a claim on this, like many other nations in that area, say, well, how can you call it the South China Sea when we call it the Eastern Sea? And all of that goes with that. Quick version on that, I gave was at a symposium in Bahrain a few years back, and we had the chairman of a major House of Representatives committee came over to give the keynote speech. Gave a very good speech, but 4 times during the speech, he referred to the Persian Gulf. Now, why would that be a problem in Bahrain? Okay. Because in Bahrain, it's not the Persian Gulf, it's the Arabian Gulf. And that's important to them. And there's a lot of political weight that goes with the words that you use. So again, think about what you're doing and realize the impact of the words you have on people. In the Foreign Service, we work, ambiguity is not a bad thing in the Foreign Service. A lot of times it's helpful to just kind of paper over an issue or a problem because the precision that you get, which my military colleagues like, they're big on precision, but you may never reach an understanding or agreement. And let me tell you, there are a lot of treaties and agreements out there that have been out there for 40 and 50 years where the two parties actually have a very different idea of what they agreed to and what they're working with, but nevertheless, it holds together because there's a common interest in having it hold together. So you just have to kind of work with that. Know who you're talking to. Usually at this point, I ask people, where did I go as an undergrad? And I'm assuming everybody on this call will know the answer to that one, but you'd be surprised how often people don't. And the point there is the people you're dealing with may well run into 20, 50, 100 people a day. And why should they remember you? Well, if you have a personal contact with them, if you have that relationship, if I'm in Bahrain or in Korea or wherever, and somebody says, hey, what's Tebow up to? Well, okay, now I have something to talk to them about. And they're, oh yeah, they're that person that asked me about Tebow. You're much more likely to remember them than if you're just one of the many faces that are coming out there along the way. When you're looking at an issue, be sure you can argue the other side. For my junior officers, that's one of the first things I would say is, okay, if we have a political view on something, tell me what the other guys are saying. Because let me tell you, if you cannot successfully articulate the other side, then you don't understand the problem. And how are you going to create a solution to that problem if you don't know what the problem is? So be aware of this. You need to do that. Take a look at the media. Take a look at all of these factors. When I was at the War College years ago, one of the best speeches or talks we had was from Colin Powell. who was NSC advisor at the time. And basically what he showed, he drove up on the board, he drew a triangle. And he said, look, when I came in entry level, and I was down here at the bottom of this pyramid, my whole world was the Army. Everybody I talked to, everybody I worked with, I socialized, they were all Army. But as I went higher and higher in that pointed triangle, and the circle got bigger and bigger, then it started going outside that. It started going beyond just the Army. Now I'm dealing with the press. Now I'm dealing with the business community. Now I'm dealing with local officials. Now I'm dealing with members of Congress. And by the time he reached the top, the senior levels, 90%, even though he was still an Army commander, 90% of his work was with people who were not in the Army, but nevertheless were important to the Army and how it could go. Look, at this stage of your life, I know you get these all the time, when I was there. One thing I did not realize when I came in was the importance of networking, of talking to people. I'm sure you're told and told you cannot overflatter somebody. Just can't be done. I mean, it's tough. It can be done, but it's really difficult to get to the point where you've overflattered somebody. Shamelessness, not a problem, but be subtle about it. Figure out ways to kind of work the conversation. Maybe you disagree with some piece of what they said, and you let them convince you that they're right. Well, again, now you've established a contact. You've done that. These are called elicitation techniques, which our friends over the other agency across the river are very, very good at. I wish we were better at along the way. Socialize. I see all the time that people hang together because you want to be with your friends. You go out after work, you drink with your friends, party with your friends and all that, and that's good. But again, you've contained yourself in a small circle here. And is that really what you need to do if you're overseas and you're supposed to be dealing with foreigners and foreign issues and what have you? Try to figure out what people want, and then try to figure out what they need, because those are always two different things. And it applies to you too. What do you want and what do you need? If you're talking to somebody, what level are you talking to them on an emotional level or an intellectual level? If you try to do both, it's very tricky. It's hard to do. Usually you pick one or the other and you go there. It helps to be nice. I can't tell you how many people have destroyed their standing because they came across as arrogant and obnoxious and elitist. Be nice. Trust me, you can get a lot more by being nice than you can by being nasty. Listening is important. Understand. All of us, mentally, when someone else is speaking, we're thinking about what we're going to say next. Well, okay, but in that, listen to what they're saying, because there may be something important in there. One of the pitches I always make is, of course, communications. I don't care what world you're in, unless you're locked in an IT booth 24 hours a day, you're going to need to communicate with people. And that means both oral and written. One of the concepts, trust me, if you can write a coherent paragraph, you are ahead of 80% of all your peers nationwide. Trust me, trust me. Paragraph, that's it. Forget a whole paper, just a paragraph. Oral communications. How do you communicate orally? How do you get your point across? Again, do you come across as trustworthy? Do you have a reputation? Are you able to articulate? Do you understand what the other person wants? Practice this. Practice giving talks, giving speeches, and all, because it is an important part of your job, whatever job you have along the way. And that includes working with the media. A lot of people, certainly in the Foreign Service, you have a lot of people who just say, oh, I never talk to the media. Well, it's part of your job is to talk to the media, because that's how you get word out and everything. But people are afraid because one bad incident destroys 100 good incidents. And trust me, I've seen it happen, and I've kind of been there a time or two myself. But nevertheless, that's a risk you take. And you minimize that risk by knowing your subject, knowing who you're talking to, knowing what your points are, and getting them across. And that's only going to come fluid, only going to become kind of as a natural process if you practice it. Because as talented as all of us are, you need to practice along the way. I mentioned earlier about figuring out why things happen. I'll tell a quick story, which I think Marianne has heard before, but she'll be polite enough to not interrupt me in it. Years ago, I was the director for Mexico at the State Department. And in those days, if you saw a map of the world in any military establishment, Mexico was blank. I mean, literally, it wasn't there. It was like the country didn't exist. And if you were asking an average American citizen to tell you about the Mexican-American War, I guarantee you most of them would not know that we ever had a war with Mexico. In Mexico, the war was yesterday. Right? It's still very much on people's minds, and they're aware of this. And because of that, we did not have military to military agreement. And the Secretary Perry of Defense, this is back in the Clinton administration, said, well, that's crazy. He's our neighbor. We need to talk to these people and have communications. So he proposed establishing a working group. My superiors at State thought this was crazy. Oh, well, why would you even bother to do that? It's doomed to failure. But he was Secretary of Defense, and so he had enough weight to kind of pull it through. So we had the first meeting. We went down to San Antonio, and we met with the Mexican delegation, and it went surprisingly well. We were on the river walk there. We actually walked past the Alamo, which I thought was kind of strange. Went and had dinner at an upscale Mexican restaurant, which I also thought was strange, but it was the defense guys working this. Okay, fine. Anyway, time comes for the return visit. And they come back and they say, okay, we're going to meet in Acapulco. So go fine. We sent that over to the White House, and the White House said, nope, meet someplace else. Acapulco is not acceptable. You have to remember in this day, there had been literally a series of beheadings and drug wars and all kinds of things going on. And so he says, it's the wrong image. We can't handle that. We're not accepting that. So I trotted back, talked to the Mexican ambassador, and he said, hey, we're inviting you. I mean, this is where, and we're inviting you to Acapulco. So it looked like all of this work was going to fall apart and collapse, and it would be a generation before we could even raise this again. So several weeks into this back and forth thing with no progress, a bright major on the secretary's staff said, what if we were to meet in the headquarters military district of Guerrero? So, now, you might suspect where exactly the headquarters military district of Guerrero is. It's in Acapulco. But we went in and we changed on all the official documents, and this is pre-word processing, so it's typing it out. And everywhere it said Acapulco, we put in headquarters military district of Guerrero. Sent it over to the White House, and they said, sure, fine, no problem. So we went and we had the visit, and it was very successful, and it's paid dividends here 20, 30 years later. The point of the story is that for 2 weeks, I and most of the other people working on this were of the opinion that there was somebody in the White House who did not want this to happen. They were opposed to having military-to-military relations with Mexico. But we were wrong. It turns out that what the problem was is they didn't like the visual of it, or the impression that meeting in Acapulco at a time when it was a drug-run city and all that was there. And we were fortunate that this major was smart enough to come up with a solution to this problem and get us to the point where we could continue with the things. Anyway, let me talk very briefly about foreign service. There are a lot of different pieces and ways to the foreign service these days. The main way, of course, is through the Foreign Service Officer Program. I'm sure if you have just Google Foreign Service Officer, you can see the whole list of things that are important to this and how you can enter. But I will note that there are other issues, other ways. We have a specialist corps, people in medical fields that serve overseas. We have a number of programs. I know the Wrangell and the Pickering Fellows. There's been a number of people from UF that have very successfully engaged in those programs. And so I would encourage you, if you have interest, to take a look at all these different options. There's even sort of a toe in the water program, a consular program, where you come in for a 5-year tour, serve overseas, work in a language facility places and get that. And then you can move on, and you could either reapply for the whole foreign service at that time or not. I will say I love being in the Foreign Service. It's not something I had really thought of before entering into it, but I found I traveled all over the world. I got to live in interesting places. Some of them were pretty tough. Some of them were, had their score of problems. But nevertheless, I have lifelong friends from each of the countries that I've served in. It's actually helped me in my current capacity. I do advice for the oil industries in Guyana and Suriname. And if you are keeping up with the oil industry, you know that that's the new hot spot in the world. Deep water well drilling, but billions of barrels of reserves. And it will change two countries. I mean, Guyana technically is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, although I think that's misleading because how you count these things. But nevertheless, they are looking at a societal transformation. And I will note that the American embassy there, our ambassador, a woman who came through the AID field, played a very important role in the election that took place there last year and helped pull the country onto a path where I think they can have success in this field. Now, in the Foreign Service, how do we deal with that? I can tell you there's economic officers at the embassy in Georgetown. They are concerned about the Dutch disease being what happens when a country has a resource that all of a sudden puts a lot of money into the national economy. And whereas you might think that's a good thing, and it is in many ways, it also has effects that distort the economy in ways that have a long-term problem. So how do you avoid that? We have consular officers there, people who will deal with visa questions, both permanent immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas. They also look after Americans. My first tour, pretty much everybody's first tour, is dealing in the consular section, and you deal with Americans in prison. If any of you have been overseas and lost your passport, you presumably, if you're back, you made it successfully back, you went to the embassy and got a new passport along the way. You have the administrative work, obviously, to keep care of everything, keep it rolling along. And we have public diplomacy, which is both dealing with the press, the media, but also we do pretty successful programs of bringing in artists, performers. I had, when I was the deputy in Burundi in Central Africa, our ambassador was a bluegrass aficionado. And so he arranged for the first bluegrass band to tour Africa ever. Might be the last one too, but he brought it in, and they were a phenomenal success in all of the countries that they went to. Interestingly, the ambassador was not a bad banjo player, and when he went back on 6 weeks leave, he toured with this group afterwards. So it was kind of nice all the way around. But these are the sorts of things we can do, and you have a direct impact at a very early age. You're given a lot of responsibility, a lot of authority to do things that have a direct impact on the people in the country that you live with and in the service of your nation. So I am, as I said, I love the Foreign Service. I'm a member of the Foreign Service Labor Relations Board still, so I still get involved in these issues. And I encourage you to take a hard look at it. I'm happy to, offline of this, if anybody is interested in sort of the test procedures and whatever, I'm a little dated now, but I can tell you the things to look for and to work with. So I know I ramble on at times. So Marianne, let me stop here and see what sort of questions we might come up with.
Thank you, Ambassador Hayes. Really appreciate your time. I see that Gus, you have your hand raised. We'll let you go first. I don't seem to have anything in the chat, but everyone feel free to raise your hand, drop questions in the chat box, and we'll call on you. Go ahead, Gus.
Oh, thanks, Marianne. Thank you, Ambassador Hayes, for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it.
Of course.
My question is more about the process of becoming a Foreign Service officer, because let's face it, it's quite competitive.
Yep.
And I know as you said, it's a little bit outdated, but what, in your opinion, is the best way to prepare for the Foreign Service exam? Even before graduating college, like what do you tell, hopefully, future Foreign Service officers what they need to do now in order to best position themselves to hopefully get into the Foreign Service in the future?
You have to look at the process, and the first hurdle, if you will, is basically the written, and that is Jeopardy. It's basically Jeopardy. It's common knowledge, and what I did, which was very helpful and may have saved me, is I took the practice exams, and I saw I had a weakness because I had no economic training, none, zero. I'm a liberal arts guy, so I went out and I got 11th edition of Samuelson. Anyway, the basic economic textbook, and I knew enough to where the MC and the MR lines. I mean, very basic, but I knew the basics. So I would say look at the practice exams and figure out where you have a weakness. It could be an art, and my quick advice is if you see a painting, you don't know who the author is, try Grant Wood, because they love, for whatever reason, they love to put Grant Wood paintings on there. But find that out. Then you go from there into, there's a written essay, and again, like I said, if you can write a paragraph, you're in great shape along the way. But what it comes down to, the real crunch point is with the personal interviews, and the question, I've done this, and the question I ask always is this a person that I want to serve with in a small post where things could go bad? Can I count on this person? Do I trust them? If you have the answer to that is yes, then you're a great way along. And I'll tell you one horror story on that. In Guyana, I had a junior officer who was brilliant. I mean, no question, brilliant. But he had grown up in Manhattan. He went to Harvard. He came to Guyana straight out of undergrad. He didn't know how to drive a car, and he had no social skills, none. I don't know how he got through all this, but he did. And he was a disaster. I mean, as smart as he was, he couldn't identify with, he couldn't talk to, he couldn't work with the local population as such. And so he was useless to me. And he left after about 6 months. He was smart. He was smart. He's smart enough to figure out he was in the wrong job there. So I go back to my opening statement. If you do well with people and you like to kind of understand, hey, what do you do? That sort of thing is very, very helpful along the way. There are jobs that are more analytic, certainly, some in the economic area, but even then, you're dealing with the business community, the commercial work. So you might have to go down to the docks, and I can tell you at 3 a.m. trying to get a shipment of shrimp that that were about to go bad, to export them out of the country. I mean, those sorts of things happen, and you have to be prepared to deal with it. But look, if you're interested in it, you're a big chunk of the way already there. So take a look at the test, figure out where your weaknesses are, and then work on them.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course. Good luck. Let me know. All right.
Okay, Emily, I see you're next in my box. Go ahead.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for talking with us today.
Of course.
I had a question about networking, because that can be kind of a vague term. And I feel like in a field such as international relations, like networking can be especially hard to meet the right people there. I was wondering what suggestions you had for that, for someone who's like maybe even just starting.
No, that's great. Look, networking, like many things, it can go very badly. I mean, if you come across as too obvious, it doesn't work. So the way around that I found, and I try to work with, is find commonality. You have to find something to talk about where they have an interest and you have an interest. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's the weather, maybe it's the political process in the country you're in, but something, a link that then allows you to become a person rather than just somebody that's out there. And look, I've dealt with Iranians and Cubans and North Koreans, and I mean, people that we don't have a lot in common with, but in the course of my job, I come across them and I have to deal with them. And sometimes you find, hey, we can talk about soccer, or as they call it, football. Well, okay, that's it. So I'm not a big soccer fan, but I studied up, and when the World Games World Cup came along, I could stay up at 3 in the morning and argue, and the next morning I could talk to my Belgian and my French and my Zaïrois colleagues and talk about it. Well, that took some work on my part because I had to pretend I was interested. But it's like they say, as soon as you can fake sincerity, you're well on your way. So look for that commonality, and you can Google everybody today. So the first thing you do that, find out where they went to school, find out what their interests are, find out where they've been in the past. Oh, you lived in Bucharest. Oh, I have a good friend in Bucharest. I mean, it's as easy as that, but you got to work at it.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right, Lucas, you're next.
Hello. Thank you again for coming to speak to us. Really appreciate it.
Great.
And my question is that I understand the entering age of foreign service officers has been getting higher in recent years, and I think it's like mid-30s right now.
Yep.
And I was wondering, do you still recommend this path right out of college, or do you think it would benefit you to gain work experience before pursuing this career?
Yeah. When I came in, 30 was the maximum age you could be. You couldn't come in at any age older than that. Now it's been lifted up. You can come up into my age almost and come in as a junior officer. I very much encourage people to come in sooner rather than later. One, as a junior officer, the sorts of work you do is entry level at the start, and that's there. We have a problem because, again, having done the interview, a lot of the people who do the interviewing will be, say, in their 60s or so. So a 24-year-old and a 37-year-old look kind of the same, at that point. And the 37-year-old, of course, has a lot more experience and maybe some more polish and everything. And so there's a tendency to kind of do that. But again, I think coming in sooner and earlier, your brain is more adaptable to foreign languages if you need to be taught a language. And most of us, even if you come in with French or Spanish or German or Arabic, there's a good chance you'll end up in other places where you're going to have to learn a new language. So coming in your 20s is much better than coming in your upper 30s, quite frankly, just how that works. But I would say, if you wanted to sort of gap year kind of stuff and do a year or two, we have people, for instance, who will do Peace Corps for a couple of years and then come into take the Foreign Service exam and come in that way. We have some people who are in the military and then come into the Foreign Service. So it can do that. But to answer your question, I would urge you to, if you're interested, do it now.
All right. Thank you very much.
Eileen, you want to go ahead?
Hello, thank you again for the presentation. So as an international studies major, what I'm worried about is that since there are hundreds of international studies major, vying for these foreign service positions, I was wondering what sort of characteristics you saw in new foreign service officers or experiences that they accumulated in the past that really made them stand out.
Yep. Well, I was an American Studies major, and it isn't offered in Gainesville anymore, but it was one of those things. I was an ologist, everything that ended in ology, I was a major in at one point or another. So I had all these hours that I had to graduate because my parents were going to cut me off. And so I ended up with a degree in American Studies. And the key in this is really, sorry, it's the dog. Hang on one second.
Sorry, I was muted. I was going to say, I think we're all used to this at this point.
He's a great watchdog, but unfortunately he barks at anything, including squirrels, deer, whatever comes to the door. Anyway, and again, I think a good basic liberal arts or even scientific background is fine, is good. It doesn't really matter. We have people, I have one of the best Foreign Service officers I came across was a guy who had no college degree. He was a New York City fireman, and he read when he wasn't putting out fires. And he knew more than 99% of the people. But we don't necessarily set a requirement that you have to have this or have that. What we're looking for is people who can adapt to situations, people who are good, have an analytic skill. If you can look at a situation and say, okay, I think this is why this is happening, that's a value, that's important. And so, having an international studies, obviously that's a plus because you're dealing, it demonstrates you have an ability to work with other peoples, other cultures, other areas, and everything. And again, in the Foreign Service, you can be in Central Africa, and 2 years later, you can be in the Far East. And a year or so after that, you're in South America. So you need to be, that flexibility is what we look for, not necessarily what the degree is.
Thank you.
Ambassador Hayes, we don't appear to have any questions right this moment, but I wanted to ask you, in addition to sort of degree seeking, are there things that students could be doing right now, opportunities they should be taking advantage of as undergrads that will help get them ready for the next step?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple of programs directly related with the state, again, Wrangell and Pickering and a few others. You do need to, I think, probably October or so for the following summer is when you would have to apply to this, usually as a sophomore or junior, you would do this. You need to have that extra time because we do require a security clearance for everybody, and that takes some time to do. So that's there. Taking advantage of speakers that come to Gainesville who are in the international area is good. We talked about networking. Don't be too bashful about going up afterwards and introducing yourselves. I am in regular email contact with probably half a dozen Gator students who I've met with in my travels along the way. And again, look, any given individual is not going to be the one who makes or breaks your career. If you have 100 contacts, maybe 2 or 3 of them may be helpful, but you have 2 or 3, and sometimes that's all it takes. If your odds go up, from 0 to something more than 0. So look for these opportunities. If you can get into any kind of federal job, if you can work for a member of Congress, a mayor, all of these things are things that we look very positively on. And it shows some initiative, and it shows, again, I keep harping on this point, but you have to be able to operate in a foreign environment. And the mayor's office in any city, I can tell you, is a foreign environment from what you're used to now. So I mean, all of these things will help you as you go along.
That's very helpful. We do have a question from Rodrigo Miranda. Go ahead.
Good evening, Ambassador. Good afternoon,
Wow.
Ambassador Hayes. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. But thank you for being here. I'm sorry I don't have a camera like everybody else.
Well, you've got a great photo there. Gorgeous, right?
I appreciate it. But I just wanted to ask, because you talked about how earlier you have to be very selective with your words, especially, and
Yep.
how pretty much everything you do in your line of work is under scrutiny at all times.
Yep.
So I just wanted to ask, what are some other mistakes that you should completely avoid when working in your line of work?
Well, the key is you're under, in some places, some countries, you're literally under the microscope 24 hours a day. If you're in what we used to call Iron Curtain country, but still the Cubas, the Russias, the Chinas of the world, you're probably on videotape most of your life, and you have to understand that. But even in a very permissive area, you tend to, I won't say stick out. And again, look, if you're in Paris or London, they're so big and there's so many people that you could be anonymous. But if you're in a Guyana, a Burundi, small posts in Eastern Europe or something, everybody will know who you are. So your deportment does count for something. And trust me, everybody knows, who's drinking, who's got financial problems, who's sleeping with who. I mean, all of that is common knowledge along the way. If you get into a bad situation because of your personal deportment, the ambassador always has the option of removing you if you become a liability rather than an asset to the area. I had a friend who, I was in Jamaica my first tour, and of course we all wanted to hang out. Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, all those guys were around. They all wanted visas. They all came to us. It was wonderful. But my colleague went down to a rough part of town. And was having drinks with a guy who got shot and killed in front of him. Well, that created a stir, as you might imagine, and the ambassador put him on a plane the next morning. I guess the answer is just like you would do anywhere. Just be aware that your personal comportment can have an impact on your job and your profession. So a bit of discretion. I say a bit because everybody goes up to a bit at least, or else why are you there? But just be aware that you're under scrutiny.
Thank you very
And
much.
that different countries have different expectations and cultures
Very
too.
much.
That
Very
what
much
is applicable in one is definitely not the norm
Yep.
in another.
Yep.
So.
As we had one of the entry on duty classes took a phrase that they had heard from their security briefing, and they made T-shirts out of it, which said "Sleep NATO." So it had all the countries in NATO which were acceptable to go on a date on Friday night with, but not the ones that were Eastern Europe or others along the way.
Does anyone else have a question? I don't see anything in the chat, but please unmute yourself if you have a question.
Well, let me hit one other item while we're waiting for that. And the Foreign Service is, we pride ourselves on being a disciplined professional service. And we serve the President of the United States and whoever that president is. We do have, there may be times when an action you feel is not in the best interest of the United States or whatever. And you really have two options at that point, because look, the Constitution has a very specific way that the president is responsible for the nation's foreign policy. So I may disagree with the president, but I'm not the president. The president's president, so you have to work with that. If you can't, then you have an option of removing yourself from that position. Now, you can either resign from the service, which people have done, a fair number, Vietnam, Bosnia, all of these things. I was faced with a choice like this years ago over a change in Cuba policy, where we were now going to send people back to Cuba without any protection, political refugees. So I resigned as coordinator for Cuban affairs, but I did not resign from the Foreign Service because my concern was I did not feel I could adequately and professionally carry out my duties on a policy that I felt very strongly against. But I could go, I was then shifted over to be director for Mexico. And there I had no problem. So if I did have a problem with trucks on I-35 or Mexican tomato imports, they did not rise to the point where I felt I could not adequately and professionally serve the president. So that's something that could come up in a career. And if it does, there are lots of precedents for how you handle that.
That's really good advice. Kat, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Marianne. Thank you for being here, Ambassador Hayes. I've really appreciated hearing your advice and your candor so far. I have a super quick technical question, actually, and I was debating whether or not to ask it, but seeing as a lot of careers, especially sort of in the international affairs realm, whether that be the Foreign Service, NGOs, nonprofits, what have you, a lot of them require a solid cover letter or kind of these written statements in order for you to kind of get a foot in the door. And I know that writing is kind of a big skill regardless. So I was actually sort of interested, especially with your experience interviewing, probably reading over applications, what some of those mistakes were that you often saw in cover letters or sort of statements of intent, or some of the things that really made them stand out that you enjoyed reading, kind of helped people get their foot in the door, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, a lot of people have what resumes that come across as impressive, and they've done a lot of things and had internships and all of these. So to me, I guess what I look for again is how will this person do if at 3 in the morning there's a coup d'etat and we have to get all the missionary families and their kids into a safe location, can I count on them or not? So it's one of those things that as you're writing, I've had some that technically were very nice, but you look at them and you go like, this person is a little too much for themselves. I don't see any interest in service beyond what they want. And so I would grade them a little bit lower than I would somebody who comes in and says, look, here's what I want to do. I want to live overseas. I enjoy working with new cultures. I want to advance our nation's interests. All of the things of that. It's more service than self-serving, I guess, is the way. But you asked a very difficult question, because a lot of it is going to be just intuitive. How do I feel? And it's hard to quantify that kind of along the way. So, but I think you'll do fine. I don't have a problem. I'm no concern about that.
To add on to that, my favorite cover letters are the ones I get that individuals tell me they are uniquely qualified for a position. At the ripe age of, and look, we've all done it. I was 22 at one point too, but none of us are actually uniquely qualified. So anyway, something to keep in mind. Ambassador Hayes, thank you so much for your time. Are there any final questions? I do want to thank all of you for joining us. We'll have a few more of these sessions this spring. And it sounds like, Ambassador Hayes, you have a couple recommendations of folks we might want to bring in. So thank you.
Yeah, just let me say, I love doing these sorts of things. I always come back very sort of recharged. I think it's a great time to serve, particularly in an overseas environment representing your country. I'm a little envious, quite frankly. I miss it to a degree. Other things I don't miss, but I miss the basic idea of it. And if you have interest in this, I strongly would encourage you to sort of follow up and see. And if I can be helpful, I'm more than happy to. So good luck to everybody. I'm hoping I can get down to Gainesville before another snowstorm comes in, but we shall see. Indeed.
Well, we're always happy to have you here, Ambassador. Yep. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. The program we're going to have in February will be with someone who worked in the New York City government for several years and now works at a major philanthropic organization in the city. And then we will also hear in March from a graduate of our Tallahassee internship program who's now working for a major lobbying firm in the state. And there'll be other programs interwoven throughout. If you have suggestions or things you all want to hear about, please feel free to email me directly, and I will send a link out to the program afterward. So thank you all very much and have a great day.
Indeed.
Thanks, Ambassador.
You bet.
See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doing it all.
Bye.